Smoke rose from the shoreline long before our ships reached the shallows, and the men at the oars slowed as they saw figures running across the sand. I remember the sound of their shouting carrying over the water, sharp and confused, as if they had not expected strangers on that morning tide. We had followed the coast since dawn, the sun low behind us, and the sea remained steady beneath the hulls. When the first arrows fell short of our bows, the commander signalled silence, and all talk stopped at once. The English guards moved in a tight line, but their steps showed uncertainty. They were not prepared for the sight of long ships cutting toward their island. I stood near the prow, watching the surf thicken around the keel, waiting for the moment our stern hit the sand. No one knew how the meeting would end. The wind stayed calm, the day clear, and the tide kept pushing us in. Whatever happened next would shape more than that small port. And as we closed the last stretch, the guards turned their spears, unsure whether to warn us away or hold their ground on that bright coastal day before us. By the time our ships grounded fully, the guards had stepped back, uncertain whether we came to trade or to test their strength. I remember jumping into the shallows, the water rising to my knees as I steadied myself against the hull. The day stayed clear, the coast stretching in both directions without any sign of reinforcements. Behind me, the crew moved with quiet discipline, carrying shields, ropes, and small chests used for exchanging goods. At first, no one raised a weapon. The English leader approached with 2 men at his sides, each holding a wooden spear angled toward the sand. Their clothing marked them as coastal defenders, not seasoned warriors. When our commander called out, his voice remained calm, asking only for the right to land and speak. For a moment it seemed the meeting might resolve without confrontation, but one man among them misread a gesture and stepped forward too quickly, startling the line behind him. Hands tightened around spear shafts, our archers shifted their footing. The tension stood clear in the daylight, spread across the beach like a loose net. Before anyone could settle the mistake, an English guard shouted and several spears dipped toward our ship. The shift in their stance changed everything. Our commander raised his hand for restraint, but the line had already tightened on both sides. I watched the English guards adjust their footing, planting their heels into the sand as though expecting us to rush forward. We did not move. The beach remained open and quiet except for the steady tide washing against the keels. A single gull circled overhead, its cries sharp in the still air. The commander stepped ahead of us, one palm raised to show he carried no weapon. The English leader hesitated, glancing at the younger men behind him, unsure whether to advance or pull them back. I could see uncertainty pressing on all of them. They had never seen ships like ours, long and narrow, carrying men who kept silent even with spears pointed at them. The tension thickened until one of their youngest guards slipped on the wet sand. His spear clattered forward, landing near our commander's feet. The English line reacted before he could retrieve it, rushing a few steps to cover him. Their sudden advance sent a clear message, whether intended or not. The balance now leaned toward conflict, held only by how both sides chose their next breath. Before the clash could ignite, our commander lifted the fallen spear and placed it upright in the sand, showing he intended no immediate strike. The gesture steadied the air for a moment. Both sides paused, the daylight revealing every movement in clear detail. I watched the English leader study the commander's actions, weighing whether this was caution or a distraction. Behind us, the crew remained disciplined, shields held but not raised, each man waiting for a single command. The surf pulled back from the beach, leaving a thin sheet of water over the sand that reflected our boots, as we stood positioned between sea and land. The English guards tightened their ranks, adjusting their spears so the tips pointed toward the ground instead of our chests. It was not trust, only hesitation. Their leader stepped closer, keeping several paces between him and the commander. He spoke of their duty to protect the coast, of warnings about raiders, of the need to know our purpose. Our commander answered plainly, explaining we sought landing rights and peaceful exchange. For a moment the guards loosened their grip, but the younger ones kept glancing at our ships, uneasy with our numbers and the silence of our men. The negotiation might have continued if not for the arrival of a small patrol from further inland. I saw them approaching along the ridge above the beach, their steps hurried and their formation loose. They carried heavier spears and wore simple leather armour, suggesting they served under a local lord rather than coastal watch. Their presence unsettled the guards already facing us, and confusion spread across their line. The patrol leader did not wait to hear the discussion. He He pointed at our ships and ordered his men to descend the slope. Sand scattered under their boots as they advanced, shouting commands to the coastal guards. The beach, calm only moments before, shifted again toward confrontation. Our commander lowered his hand slowly, signalling the crew to prepare without provoking. Behind me, shields came forward but stayed low, held in readiness rather than hostility. The English patrol reached the front and began questioning their own men, their voices rising with accusation and urgency. They did not know what had passed between us, only that strangers stood armed at their shore. As the patrol tightened their line, their leader raised his spear toward our commander. The decision was forming, and everyone on the beach sensed it. The tension on that beach marked only the beginning, for in the seasons that followed, our journeys toward the English coast became more frequent and more deliberate. When we returned after the first landing, the sea remained as calm as before, but the shoreline felt different. Villages that once stood open now kept watch from behind small earth walls, and the coastal guards stationed themselves earlier in the day. I remember our ships drifting close enough to see smoke rising from cooking fires, yet no one approached until we signalled our intent. These visits moved beyond chance encounters. The men spoke often of the wealth stored in monasteries and towns, places built inland but still linked to the coast by narrow paths. Traders told us of silver kept by priests, of grain reserves guarded by a few lightly armed men, and of churches filled with goods brought from across the kingdoms. The information spread quietly through our settlements, guiding the decisions of those who commanded ships. When we set out again, the crew understood the purpose clearly. The English coast was no longer unfamiliar. It was becoming a place where opportunity and resistance existed side by side, shaped by each tide that carried us back. With each landing, the rhythm of our movements changed, turning short visits into regular ventures along the English shore. I recall mornings when the ships launched before sunrise, the sea flat and pale beneath the early light as we rowed toward familiar headlands. The English defenders had grown more cautious, but their patrols remained limited. Scattered across long stretches of coast they struggled to control. We often arrived before they expected any presence, finding beaches empty except for fishing boats pulled far above the tide line. From there, parties moved inland to observe settlements, counting livestock, measuring fields, and noting how quickly the people gathered at the sound of warning horns. None of this happened with haste. Our commanders preferred clarity over confrontation, studying how each community responded before taking any action. Some villages offered food or simple goods to avoid conflict, while others closed their gates and waited. The English monasteries, built of timber and stone, stood as clear markers of wealth and provisions. Their bells carried over long distances, guiding us more reliably than any map. Over time, these careful observations shaped a pattern both we and the English came to recognise, though neither side fully understood how it would grow. As these patterns strengthened, the crews grew more confident in navigating the inlets and estuaries that broke the English coastline. We learned which channels remained deep at low tide, which rivers could carry a ship inland, and which stretches of sand supported the weight of men marching in formation. I remember one landing where our scouts moved ahead while the ships remained anchored just offshore. They returned with measured reports: a cluster of timber houses, a small storehouse, fields planted close to the settlement, and no sign of a fortified wall. The commanders listened without urgency, comparing the information to earlier observations. The English villagers worked quietly in the fields, unaware of our presence until our rowboats touched the shore. Even then, they reacted with uncertainty rather than open defiance. Some backed away toward their homes, while others paused mid-task, unsure whether to flee or negotiate. We approached at a steady pace, shields slung behind us and weapons sheathed. The meeting held no immediate violence. Instead, the villagers brought small quantities of grain and cloth, leaving them on the ground and retreating a few steps. The commanders accepted the offerings, noting the gesture but making no promises. It was an exchange born of caution on both sides. Not every village responded with the same restraint. Further along the coast, settlements had begun to send warnings to nearby monasteries and lords whenever unfamiliar ships appeared. We noticed this change during a landing near a narrow estuary. Before our boots touched the sand, a bell rang from a wooden tower inland, its sound reaching us across the water. The commanders halted the advance, choosing to observe rather than press forward. Moments later, a small group of English men arrived at the shoreline, armed with spears and shields of simple construction. They formed a line but did not attack, waiting instead for our next movement. The commanders stepped ahead, studying their formation and equipment. These men carried heavier spears and wore thicker wool garments, layered beneath leather pieces, suggesting they had been sent by a local authority rather than acting on their own. Their leader called out, asking our intent and warning us not to approach the settlement. Our commander answered plainly, stating we would remain at the shore and take nothing without cause. The exchange stayed tense yet controlled. In the clear daylight, both sides evaluated the other, neither willing to risk a mistake that might turn observation into confrontation. Encounters like these shaped the decisions that followed. The commanders began marking places where the English responded quickly and those where defences remained thin. They studied how far warnings travelled between villages, how many men each area could gather, and how prepared monasteries were to protect their stores. I recall one afternoon when we landed near a wide meadow that bordered a small religious site. The monks watched from the doorway, their garments plain and their expressions measured. They neither fled nor approached. Our scouts reported that only a few lay brothers guarded the area, and that the stores contained grain, tools, and a modest amount of valuables. Yet the commanders chose not to advance, deciding instead to map the nearby path and return later with clearer intent. The English presence remained visible at a distance, a few men standing near the fields with wooden clubs and old spears. The crew waited in silence as the commanders finished their survey, noting the river access and the location of the footbridge leading inland. When the scouts returned, we reboarded without incident, pushing off from the shore as the tide turned. Each landing added to our understanding, guiding the larger movements that would eventually reshape the region. Years passed before I saw the English coast again, and by then the world I had known had changed. The small raids of earlier seasons had given way to larger gatherings, led not by a few ship commanders, but by men whose names carried weight across our settlements. When I returned to the harbours of our homeland, I found hundreds preparing for a journey unlike any before. Ships were being repaired, provisions gathered, and warriors arriving from distant fjords. Ivar, Halfdan and Urba were spoken of with certainty, their plans detailed and their intentions clear. This was not a venture for simple trade or limited raids. It was a movement shaped by leaders who sought more than silver. I remember walking the docks, watching crews load shields and spears with quiet discipline. The sound of carpenters tightening planks echoed across the shoreline. Even the older men understood the scale of what was forming. Messengers travelled between settlements, marking the days until departure. When the fleet finally assembled, the shoreline filled with the sight of long ships drawn together in a line that stretched farther than I had seen before. The sea waited calmly as if holding its breath for what would follow. When we reached East Anglia, the English response differed from earlier years. Instead of resistance at the shore, their leaders chose negotiation. I remember our ships landing on a wide, open stretch of coast, where the sand carried the marks of recent patrols, but no defenders stood in sight. The local rulers offered supplies and horses, recognising the strength of the force gathered before them. Our leaders accepted, not as conquerors, but as men preparing for a greater campaign inland. The process moved with order. Groups of warriors inspected the horses, testing reins and hooves, while others unloaded equipment to prepare for the march ahead. The English representatives watched closely but made no attempt to obstruct. They understood that refusal would alter the terms of our presence. Once mounted, the army advanced steadily toward the territories of Northumbria. The air remained clear, and the fields stretched wide on both sides as we rode in formation. I recall passing farmsteads where doors stayed shut and smoke rose quietly from hearths inside. The people saw the movement of a force unlike any that had entered their lands before. Our leaders pushed forward without haste, intent on reaching the city that would define the next steps. The march toward York revealed how unprepared the region was for a force of our size. Villages along the route offered little resistance, their defenders too few to challenge the column moving across their fields. Scouts rode ahead each morning, returning with reports of open roads, abandoned outposts, and small groups fleeing toward the city. I recall the measured pace set by our leaders, ensuring the men remained organised and the horses rested at regular intervals. The land itself showed signs of recent disputes among the English kingdoms, with burned farmsteads and neglected fields marking places where their own conflicts had weakened them. When we crossed the river routes leading north, the commanders ordered careful observation of every bridge and ford, noting which paths could support the broad movement of warriors and supplies. At midday, when the sun stood high, we stopped near a cluster of empty houses. The crews rested beside wells and livestock pens left behind in haste. Even then there was no disorder among our ranks. The army continued forward with purpose, aware that York stood ahead as a key stronghold. Each mile brought clearer signs that the city would not be ready for what approached. When we reached the outskirts of York, the defences appeared worn and poorly manned. The city walls, built of timber and earth, showed signs of disrepair, and the watchtowers held only a few men at their posts. Scouts reported internal conflict among the Northumbrian rulers, a division that had left the city vulnerable at a critical moment. Our leaders positioned the army in a wide arc around the approaches, ensuring that no escape routes remained open. Throughout the day, the warriors prepared their equipment, checking spearheads, tightening shield straps, and adjusting saddle fittings for those mounted. The English within the city attempted negotiations, sending a small group to speak with our commanders. Their words came with urgency, offering terms meant to delay rather than resolve the situation. Our leaders listened but made no commitment. The city's weakness was clear, and the men understood that its capture was within reach. As the sun climbed higher, the commanders spread the forces, marking positions for the advance. No unnecessary movement occurred. Every action followed an ordered plan formed long before we arrived. The quiet surrounding the walls revealed how uncertain the defenders were, aware that the situation was shifting beyond their control. The attack began without confusion. At the command, the warriors moved forward in organised ranks, shields held firmly and spears angled for close engagement. The first push came against a section of the wall where the timber had weakened, allowing the men to force openings with controlled effort. I stood among those assigned to maintain pressure on the breach, advancing steadily as the structure gave way. Inside the perimeter, the defenders attempted to regroup, but their numbers were too few and their formations uneven. Our leaders directed the movement with clear signals, guiding units deeper into the streets without allowing them to scatter. The city's narrow lanes carried the sounds of combat, but the progression remained ordered. We secured key intersections, ensuring no counterforce could assemble. By midday, resistance had waned, and the last pockets of defenders withdrew toward the central buildings. Our commanders ordered restraint, preventing unnecessary destruction. When the final positions fell, the army halted, securing the area before assessing provisions, structures, and strategic points within the city. York had been taken, not through haste, but through preparation that had begun long before our arrival. The outcome marked a turning point, understood by every man present. After York fell, the army did not disperse. Instead, our leaders used the city as a place to regroup, repair equipment, and plan the next movements across the English kingdoms. I remember the steady rhythm of activity inside the walls, warriors sharpening spearheads, craftsmen reinforcing shields, and scouts mapping the routes leading south and west. The English who remained in the city watched us with caution, but offered no resistance. They understood that the balance of power had shifted. Messages arrived from neighbouring regions describing unrest among the Northumbrian nobles, some seeking alliances and others preparing to flee. Our leaders met each morning, reviewing the reports brought in by riders. Their decisions were deliberate, aimed at strengthening the hold on the region before advancing further. When additional ships arrived from our homeland, carrying men and supplies, the sense of growing organisation became clear. By mid-season, the army had gathered enough resources to move outward from the city in several directions. Each group received precise instructions, ensuring that every route remained connected to the others. As we prepared to march, the quiet inside York contrasted with the purpose that carried us forward. The campaign was no longer about isolated victories. It had become sustained war. Our next movements brought us into contact with the kingdoms bordering Northumbria, where the English resistance varied from open defiance to cautious withdrawal. I recall riding through valleys where small defensive groups positioned themselves along ridges, watching us but avoiding direct combat. Their hesitation came from the uncertainty created by internal disputes among their rulers. Some sought negotiations while others attempted to gather forces for counterattacks. Our leaders advanced methodically, sending scouts ahead to mark fortified positions, river crossings, and sheltered routes. The army travelled in organised segments, each unit responsible for its own supplies and equipment. When we reached the territories claimed by Mercia, the landscape widened into rolling fields and small clusters of settlements. The people there reacted with a mixture of preparation and apprehension. Some fortified their boundaries with freshly raised earthworks, while others abandoned farms before we arrived. The commanders kept communication constant among the units, ensuring that no group strayed beyond the planned routes. Each day began with clear orders, reviewed by the captains before the army set out. Our pace remained steady, shaped by the terrain and the reports brought back by riders. The English kingdom sensed the shift in strength, and their responses reflected the uncertainty of the moment. As we moved deeper into Mercian lands, the importance of fortified towns became clear. Some settlements relied on simple wooden palisades, while others used older earthworks shaped by earlier generations. Our commanders evaluated each location, deciding whether to bypass, negotiate, or press forward. I remember one approach toward a settlement built near a river bend. Its defences strengthened with recently added timber sections. Scouts reported that the garrison inside numbered fewer than expected. When we reached the outskirts, the defenders formed a line outside the gate but made no attempt to advance. Their leader stepped forward, offering terms for safe passage if we refrained from entering the town. The commanders considered the offer, recognising that the settlement held limited supplies and would slow our progress if taken by force. We accepted the terms, continuing along the riverbank while the defenders watched silently. Such encounters repeated as the army advanced. Some towns prepared for conflict, others sought to avoid it altogether. The consistency of our movements kept the English uncertain about where the next pressure would fall. Each decision our leaders made centred on maintaining momentum, ensuring the army could continue toward regions that held greater strategic value. Further south, resistance grew more organised. The English began assembling larger groups, positioning them along key roadways and river crossings. These forces did not always seek open battle, yet their presence signalled a shift in their strategy. I remember one morning when our scouts returned with reports of a sizable English force gathering near a junction of two well-used paths. The commanders ordered the army to adjust its route, moving across higher ground to gain a clearer view of the situation. From that vantage, we observed the English repositioning, uncertain whether to hold their ground or withdraw. Our leaders chose to advance in measured formation, not to provoke an immediate clash, but to test their resolve. As we drew nearer, the English force began to break apart, dividing into smaller units that retreated toward nearby settlements. We continued forward, maintaining formation without altering the pace. This pattern repeated often, English forces gathering briefly, then dispersing when confronted by the size and order of our advance. Their actions revealed both caution and a lack of unified command. For us, the path remained clear as long as the army stayed organised, and the commanders continued to coordinate each movement with precision. The campaigns of that season culminated in a series of movements that brought us close to the borders of Wessex, where the English resistance became more focused. Reports described a ruler who prepared his forces with greater discipline, gathering men from settlements across the region. Before reaching those territories, our commanders halted the advance to allow the units to regroup. Camps were established along a stretch of open ground near a shallow river, providing access to fresh water and space for order. I recall days spent reinforcing equipment and reviewing maps drawn by our scouts. The commanders met regularly, studying the routes ahead and discussing how the English might respond. The men used the time to rest, repair clothing, and tend to the horses. Though no confrontation occurred during those days, we understood that the next phase would differ from earlier campaigns. The English to the south had not been weakened by internal disputes to the same degree as the northern kingdoms. When the army prepared to move again, the sense of readiness was clear in every unit. The calm of the camp contrasted with the knowledge that the next encounters would shape the direction of the campaign. When we crossed into the lands that later formed the boundary of the Danelaw, the army's purpose shifted from constant movement to establishing places we could hold. The commanders no longer focused solely on advancing. Instead, they examined fields, river crossings, and settlement layouts, noting which areas could support long-term presence. I remember riding through open farmland where English villagers stopped their work to observe us from a distance. Some remained close to their homes, while others moved livestock toward wooded areas for safety. The army spread out in measured groups, not to intimidate but to assess the land with clarity. Scouts mapped locations suited for winter camps, marking each with careful detail. Our leaders met with local representatives who chose negotiation over resistance, offering provisions in exchange for safety. These interactions took place in open daylight, with both sides keeping their movements plain and deliberate. The shift was evident in the behaviour of the men as well. They repaired tools for farming as often as they tended their weapons, understanding that the coming seasons would require more than battle. The decisions made during those days prepared the ground for settlements that would remain long after the campaign ended. As these settlements formed, agreements with English rulers became part of the army's work. Some leaders accepted terms that divided land and established clear boundaries, recognising that continued conflict would only weaken their positions. I recall a meeting held near a wide river where both sides stood on firm ground, each represented by men chosen for their reliability. The exchange remained straightforward. The English offered land, supplies and hostages to ensure the agreement held. Our commanders accepted with equal clarity, outlining the conditions under which the army would halt its advance. Once the terms were set, markers were placed along the surrounding fields to define the new limits. The men built simple structures using timber gathered from nearby woods, creating shelters that could withstand the changing season. Warriors rotated watch duties while others worked on reinforcing paths and preparing storage areas for grain. The English communities nearby resumed their routines, moving cautiously but without the fear that had marked earlier encounters. These early arrangements formed the foundation for the territories that became known as the Danelaw. They represented a shift from constant warfare to a structured coexistence, shaped not by sudden decisions but by deliberate agreements carried out in full daylight. As the seasons progressed, some of our men chose to remain in the settlements permanently, taking land to cultivate and building homes beside the English, who had accepted the new order. I remember walking through a clearing where newly raised timber houses stood beside older Anglo-Saxon dwellings, the differences in construction visible but not in conflict. The settlers worked the fields with steady discipline, using ploughs and tools shaped by local craftsmen. English farmers observed at first from a distance, then gradually joined in shared tasks when the work demanded more hands. Our commanders ensured that agreements were upheld, sending patrols only to maintain order and monitor the boundaries marked earlier. Children watched from doorways as men from both sides repaired fences or carried grain to shared storage areas. This cooperation was practical rather than symbolic, built on the understanding that stability benefited all who lived there. Even those who had once fought against the army recognised the value in predictable routines. Markets began to form near river crossings, where goods from both cultures exchanged without disruption. The presence of our people no longer signalled conflict, but an ongoing structure that shaped daily life across the region. As these mixed settlements strengthened, our leaders turned their attention to establishing laws that could support the new arrangements. Meetings were held in open fields where both sides gathered representatives to discuss matters of land, labour and responsibility. I stood among those sent to observe the proceedings. The discussions remained clear and focused, dealing with boundaries, compensation for disputes, and expectations for maintaining roads and waterways. Neither side sought to impose traditions without consideration. Instead, the laws formed through a combination of practical needs and established customs. English reeves and our appointed leaders inspected fields together, confirming property lines and ensuring that agreements were upheld without favouritism. Warriors who once served solely in battle now enforced these decisions, acting as guards and messengers rather than raiders. The consistency of these actions brought order to the towns and surrounding land. Over time, fewer disputes required formal resolution, as both communities adjusted to the shared structure. The settlements took on a stable rhythm, shaped by clear rules that could be applied without confusion. The atmosphere remained steady, supported by routines that allowed work to continue in every direction across the land. By the time the region reached a lasting balance, it was clear that neither side remained unchanged. The English adopted some of our methods for organising labour and defending their boundaries, while many among our people learned the local ways of tending fields and managing livestock. I often travelled between settlements, delivering messages or inspecting routes, and the differences between them narrowed with each passing season. Markets grew busier, roads better maintained, and river crossings reinforced with timber platforms built by combined effort. The presence of our warriors became part of daily life, not as conquerors, but as protectors of agreements kept by both communities. When tensions arose, they were met with structured solutions rather than sudden force. The land itself reflected this cooperation, with new farms taking shape where unused fields once stood. By then, the memory of the initial campaigns felt distant, replaced by the steady routines that defined the Danelaw. The region no longer resembled the contested territory we had first entered. It had become a place where people lived under a system shaped by both cultures, guided by clear agreements and practical needs that ensured stability across the changing seasons. If you made it this far, thank you for spending your time here. If you'd like to hear more quiet history like this, consider subscribing. Your support truly means a lot.